Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be in community with you and see you all through the vortex of our virtual training here today. I know we have a lot of folks registered for this training as the topic is incredibly important and something that we all really need to be reminded of on a daily basis when we go through and do the work that we do in our community. So thank you for joining us for Trauma Informed Representation. Thank you for all that you all do for the legal aid community. We hope that this training equips you all with the knowledge that you need in order to be the best advocate for your clients who experience the trauma that they do. So, housekeeping always. The live captioning has been turned on. If you need help seeing it, you should be able to click a button and press show captions. If you have any issues, please just reach out in the chat and let me know. Speaking of the chat, I will enable the chat after I'm done with the introductions, so give me a second there. Third housekeeping announcement, CLE credit was approved for this awesome training. Of course it was. I had no doubt it would be. That CLE credit does include some special credits for mental illness. So that code will be announced by me at the end of today's session. I will also be sure to put it into the chat. As always, if it looks like we're rounding the end and I haven't done it, don't be shy. Please feel free to put into the chat, hey Alexis, what's the CLE code? This is being recorded. A copy of this recording will be sent out to all registrants and folks who are here live as well. So if you have a fire you got to put out and you've got to drop off, don't worry. You will receive the entire recording within 24 hours. The email actually comes from Zoom, so keep an eye out on your inbox. And the final housekeeping announcements is questions and answers. Our presenters have graciously agreed to answer your questions as they come up. So put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A box. I will do my best to interrupt them when there's a good time and present your questions. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to move into introductions. Today we have with us Teresa Pritchard, who is the Associate Director and General Counsel at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. She provides technical assistance to attorneys, victim advocates, and community responders regarding legal issues impacting sexual violence victims across the state, and provides direct representation to victims and survivors in civil legal actions, and works with programs to protect survivors' privacy in court. Before joining the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence in January of 2014, Teresa spent over 5 years as an attorney at Legal Services of North Florida, representing domestic and sexual violence survivors in immigration and family law matters. She is a co-author of Interventions in the Aftermath of Sexual Violence, Justice, Advocacy, and Treatment in the Handbook of Interpersonal Violence Across the Lifespan. She graduated from the Florida State University College of Law in 2008, where she advocated for children in prison as a member of the former Children's Advocacy Center at FSU, now the Public Interest Law Center, and clerked at Legal Services of North Florida as a Florida Bar Foundation Fellow. She received her BA in Anthropology from the University of South Florida. Thank you so much for being here, Teresa, truly an expert on this topic that we're going to get into. So we also have with us Melissa Ashton. Melissa has been in the field of victim services since 2001 and holds a master's degree in social work from Florida State. Her career began at the Leon County State's Attorney's Office before moving on to the Broward County State Attorney's Office, where she worked primarily supporting survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence. Ms. Ashton has also worked at the Office of the Attorney General as a victim compensation claims analyst before serving as an assistant dean of students and director of Florida State University's Victim Advocate Program, where she worked with survivors of all types of crimes. Melissa has also worked at FSU's College of Social Work as an adjunct professor, instructing the family violence course. Melissa has served on the board of directors for the Big Bend Victim Assistance Coalition and the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence prior to joining the council as a full-time employee. Melissa worked with the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence for 6 years, during which she worked as a statewide victim services manager with the Legal Assistance to Victims Project and the director of programs. Recently, Melissa joined Legal Services of North Florida as their Director of Programs. Again, another absolute expert in this field. And we can't thank you enough for taking the time to train us on this important topic. And again, for all that you two do for our survivor community.
Thank you, Alexis. And as Alexis mentioned, we'll be going through the slides. We're happy to take your questions as we go along. I'll be proceeding through the slides, so don't, feel free to jump in. We would prefer that. This is a training for you all. So if you have questions, you're going to get copies of our slides and you have our contact information. But as questions come up in the moment, please don't hesitate to ask them, because this training, this information is for all of us. It's for you all who are here today. So we want to make sure you get the information and get to ask the questions that you want to ask. Melissa, did you want to add anything before we get?
No, it all sounds great. I think I need to beef up my my bio there. Yours sounded great.
Well, I have to say, the co-author of that, chapter in that book that Alexis mentioned, my other co-author is Melissa, and she forgot to mention that in her bio. So we hope you guys can check that out. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started. And just to kind of tip off our objectives for today, Melissa, do you want to go through these?
Sure, we're just gonna go through the scope of the problem of sexual violence, the impact that sexual violence has on not only the individual, but communities as well. We also thought it was important today to talk about the neurobiology of trauma. I'm going to try to keep it and run through that as quickly as I can. It's kind of one of my areas that I enjoy talking about. And then we're going to also discuss the client relationship, what that looks like, how you can make sure it's trauma informed when you're developing that relationship. Representation, what trauma-informed representation should look like when you're working with survivors of trauma. Safety planning, which some of you I know may already be doing, but if you're new or you've been around a while and you just kind of need a refresh on it, hopefully that will help you. And then lastly, we have some resources and our reference list that we'll share with you if you want to learn more about any of the topics that we're discussing today.
Thanks, Melissa. And we have additional materials as well that aren't linked in the PowerPoints, but we will, I'm going to send them to Alexis when we're finished here today, so that she can provide them to you all, so you have some other resources. And as Melissa mentioned, and you heard from our bios, we do our histories and our experience. We've worked a lot with victims of violence, and most recently, Melissa and I both have focused on, in recent years, working with victims specifically of sexual violence. A lot of this information is, if you're a legal services provider, I think I've never worked in private practice, but I think that, even potentially working with clients in private practice who've experienced some conflict or might be experiencing some trauma, whether it's sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, or other, vulnerable communities that you work with who, maybe your folks aren't explicitly disclosing that they have a history of violence, but they might have experienced some trauma. Typically when they come forth to us for representation, that a lot of these concepts are transferable. And in working with victims of sexual violence, we experience a lot, they experience a lot of backlash in the community, backlash within the court system. So we thought this was a good population to use as an example, because they experience some extreme effects of trauma. So, but like I said, a lot of this is transferable to other cases you might have. Even if you have clients who haven't disclosed, they might be exhibiting some signs of trauma. So hopefully you can still find these concepts helpful. So we're going to quickly go over just what we refer to as the scope of the problem for folks who might not be as versed in sexual violence and the impact. So this is kind of an old survey, but the 2009 Children's Exposure to Violence Survey showed that about 6% of all children had been sexually victimized. And especially when we look at adolescents, and we're talking about ages 14 to 17, And a lot of statistics, if you look deeper into this population, you'll see between the ages of 12 and 24, 25, there are high rates of violence. But when we look at adolescents, kind of in those high school years, we're the most likely to be sexually victimized, with nearly 1 in 6 reporting being victimized in the last year, and 1 in 4 had reported a victimization during their lifetime. And just to give you, we'll have a few slides on statistics, but just to give you some background, obviously statistics can be really skewed and misrepresentative. They're really dependent on what questions are asked. If you have some biased questions, you're going to, maybe not get the best information. If you have sexual violence is a deeply personal, and we'll talk about some of the impacts and why some people might not be comfortable disclosing, but very deeply personal, and some people might not be comfortable reporting. So just kind of, we're giving you this information as an overview, but just keep in mind that they're just numbers, and it's even as high of these rates of reporting are, they could actually be higher if you were looking at, depending on what questions are asked and who's comfortable answering the questions. So most recently, we have a link down here to the CDC puts out information about reports of folks who are comfortable disclosing, and nearly, or over a quarter of US women have reported a completed or attempted rape. But now in the state of Florida, that is, if you go to our statutes, that's going to be coded as sexual battery. And what we're talking about when we talk about rape or sexual battery is penetration, not just groping, or not harassment or inappropriate touching or sexual touching, but this would be actual attempted or completed penetration without consent. And 3% of US men have reported being a victim. And again, when we talk about statistics being skewed, it's men especially might be experiencing some shame around reporting. So I not being a statistician, but I would suspect that that's a pretty low stat right there. Now, other than rape, I mentioned sexual harassment, non-consensual sexual touching without penetration. Also, if you're getting, folks getting sent nude pictures or harassing pictures or sexual cyber harassment, when we talk about those kinds of, that range of sexual violence, nearly half of US women have reported experiencing those forms of violence, and nearly a quarter of men have responded that they've experienced such non-penetrative violence. And when we talk about the age of penetration, it's happening very young. So we talked about that, those statistics in the last slide, and over 80% of women and 70% of the men who've reported being victimized report that it happened before they were the age of 25. And I'm not sure if we touch on this in here, Melissa, but just to let you all know, a lot of times folks don't experience, they're not victimized just once. So if they're being victimized very early, and we'll talk about, Melissa talks about kind of how victims might cope and some other things they might experience in the aftermath of a victimization, and how it impacts them over the course of their lifetime, but can lead them to be vulnerable to multiple victimizations across their lifespan. So very high rates of folks experiencing the attempted or completed rape before they're 25 years of age. And for men, much younger, about a quarter of them, or over a quarter of them, have experienced completed or attempted rape younger, at age of 10 or younger. Melissa, did you want to add to that?
No, I think we all know that men are less likely to report than women, because there's a lot more shame just built in. Men are, socialized to believe that they can protect themselves and should protect themselves. So there's kind of an added layer of that self-blame for men. So we know that number is much higher.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in addition to these numbers, and again, these numbers can be really biased, these surveys can be biased, majority of victims have reported that they knew their perpetrator. So it could be an acquaintance, a friend, a classmate, a coworker, a neighbor, a family member, or partner. Very high rates when we talk about sexual violence, often it's somebody they know, but not necessarily an intimate partner. And rates of sexual violence are even higher for women, American Indian women, multiracial women who report identify as multiracial. And then this number, I pulled this number from Forge, which is an amazing nonprofit that works specifically looking at rates of violence on folks who identify as trans or non-binary. And this is a stat from 2012 where they reported approximately 50% of folks had reported experiencing sexual violence, but they also and this is an old stat because Forge kind of as I stated before, they have the perspective of, these numbers can be skewed, they can be not necessarily representative of what's going on. So it's not always necessarily important to look at the numbers. Although if you are working at legal services or a nonprofit or legal aid, how important it is to track your numbers so we can continue to get to qualify for grants or be able to report on that. But in the moment and in terms of addressing violence in reality, the numbers are less important than the actual person in front of you. And I came across this quote, which I just love, and I think is really representative of exactly what Melissa and I believe and this training. And this came from the Forge survey where a survivor had reported, "I look for competence and compassion. I don't want to be a number." So hopefully, we're here to support you in, become, well, we know you're competent attorneys, but, being compassionate and trauma informed. And I think, a lot of times we say trauma informed, but really at the end of the day, like if you have compassion for these folks, for the folks who are in front of you and the folks who are reporting to you and looking for help, that's really important. Melissa, did you want to jump in? I'm trying to go through these so we can get to your important.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. And we get into the meat of your training, of your information there. And so just talking about, again, the numbers that really matter at, I think it's and it's the client who's in front of you seeking help and seeking services. And we'll talk a little bit about how difficult that can be at times, especially with these types of cases and what we see from the court system and what we see from systems generally and from the public, but really one-on-one with the client, that's what we're looking to focus on today. And, that's the number to think about and to be concerned about is the person who's in front of you seeking help and seeking that trauma-informed and compassionate response. Mel, did you want to take this? And I think
Sure.
I'll just pull these all up here.
So a lot of the impacts of sexual violence, I think, are known. We know that there's a risk of STDs, STIs due to a sexual assault. Pregnancy, that's always a risk. And now fewer options for survivors if they are pregnant as a result of sexual violence. We know that's an issue, an emerging issue at this point. Lacerations to their genitals or anal lacerations, as well as other physical, injuries that may have been due to being held down or pulled. So making sure that, your client has access to all the resources they may need to make sure their physical well-being is taken care of is always critical. And then trauma. We know that the trauma of this nature is one of the most devastating crimes that a person can experience, and that there is an increased risk. It's been researched and validated that, there's an increased risk to developing issues around substance use and mental health problems for survivors. A lot of survivors with that unresolved trauma experience ongoing post-traumatic stress disorder. They're triggered a lot. They have a lot of nightmares, and they have difficulty just functioning day to day due to that unresolved trauma. Suicide is another risk for this population when they're not in community or getting support from, friends, family, others. And even when they are, often there's the side that they don't always show other people, that they don't feel safe showing how impacted they are by this victimization. And a lot of survivors, when I worked at the university, could have one of two reactions. A lot would become very self-isolating and in a way to protect themselves from this happening again. And then there would be other survivors who would engage in more risk-taking behaviors. And I think that a lot of times their thought pattern was, well, if I always say yes, then I'm never saying no, so I can never be assaulted again. So a lot of those behaviors, those risk-taking behaviors would involve more sexual partners and things of that nature. And then, of course, lifelong trauma. Again, if that trauma goes unresolved and they're not seeking support for that, that trauma is going to express itself in their lives. It's going to express themselves in their relationships. It can come down to expressing itself in physical illness, and also, of course, the mental illness piece as well.
Thanks, Melissa. And I don't think we have this within our slides, but as I mentioned earlier, the substance abuse and the mental health problems actually make folks more vulnerable to sexual violence. So if they're, developing these dependency issues in the wake of a victimization, it actually makes them more susceptible to repeated victimization, not necessarily by the same person. It could be by a different perpetrator or perpetrators, and later on in life. But it just kind of it lends itself to a cycle. So it's really important that they are receiving a trauma-informed response. Here we go. So when I started doing this work, my mom said to me that, it's crazy. Why don't something happens to you, you go to the police. And what we've seen is that only about 30%, 32% of completed or attempted rapes are actually reported to law enforcement. It's the least reported non-property related crime. So it's the least reported kind of interpersonal violence crime. And, why don't they just report? Melissa, do you want to take this? You're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. There are so many reasons survivors don't report, and this is just kind of scratching the surface here. But that shame of what happened to them, that they let it to happen to them, that they weren't in control of the situation is a big one. Guilt for maybe they made a poor decision, but a poor decision does not mean that you should be sexually assaulted. You're allowed to make poor decisions. Everyone does it every day, but it doesn't mean that you deserve to be sexually assaulted. That fear, the fear of not being believed, the fear of being blamed, that fear is one of the, I think, strongest reasons why survivors don't report. They've already lost control, over the victimization, and they had no control over the fact that they were victimized. So the fear of losing control over a process that, we don't even know what the outcomes are going to be, is just too great to overcome for them to report. Denial. I know Teresa and I both have heard, survivors label their victimization a multitude of different ways. I was taken advantage of. I made a poor decision. Lots of different ways, but actually admitting that they were raped or sexually assaulted is often just a bridge too far for them. They want to protect their families or their loved ones, if it's a family member, or even if it's a close friend that, they consider someone that they need in their lives. So they want to protect those people. That's definitely a big consideration for survivors going forward to report. Oh yeah, of course. If the perpetrator, if the perpetrator is a friend, if it's in their friend group, they don't want to impact that friend group. They don't want to lose additional friends over reporting. And that's a fear. So they'd rather just not report, just deal with it and maintain their friend group or their family.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Melissa, but I've seen this a lot with my clients who are in high school or maybe college, and that, like Melissa said, that might be in the friend group. When we talk about civil legal services, for survivors, maybe they just want to switch classes. They want to change up their class schedule so they don't see the person. They want to change their work schedule so they're not working late shifts. and going home and, in the dark. So it's not always related specifically to getting an injunction or having some relief against the perpetrator, but making accommodations within their lives so they feel safer. And so we're working through it. We'll talk about safety planning and later on. So that those are a lot of questions, and a lot of times they're able to achieve that without a lawyer. Sometimes they do need a lawyer to make a couple of calls for them, and then in extreme situations it might end in litigation, potentially on their behalf if they have some legal remedy. But I feel like this, especially with the younger clients, and like I said, the high school or college age, they don't want the perpetrator to go to prison for life. They're like, I just want to feel safe when I go to my classes. I don't know, Melissa, how.
Yeah, no, it's spot on. I mean, more often than not, survivors are looking to maintain their life, trying to keep things as normal as possible, as routine as possible, without anything interfering with their work, their academics, their home life. So a lot of times when I was working with students at FSU, they were exactly that. I just want to be able to go to class and not fear running into him or them. So that was really the priority. And I think it's critical, no matter what your role is, if it's a friend that comes to you, being able to support what that survivor wants versus what you think that they should do in any given situation. And that allows for them to start to take that control back.
Yeah. And that's especially true as lawyers. I know I've had cases where I have somebody come to me and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You have this great case. From the lawyer in me comes out like, wow, you can litigate this and litigate that. And they'll say, look, again, like, I just want to go to class and feel safe. I don't want $10 million. And that's their right. We're here to advise them and talk them through things and let them know what their options might be. But at the end of the day, like Melissa said, it's important for them to have that control and make those decisions, and for us to respect those decisions. So we pulled this from End Violence Against Women International. Hopefully you can see the reference down there at the bottom, but it will pop up when you get the slides. And this is the justice gap. So when we talked about if we look at about 100 rapes being committed, an estimated 5 to 20 are reported to police. And then that less than 1 to maybe 5 are actually prosecuted. And there are various reasons. Obviously, we know the criminal legal system has different standards that they have to meet for conviction. And then 0.2 to 5.2 may result in a conviction, and then actual incarceration, you're looking at less than 3. So less than 3% of actual rapes committed are going to result in incarceration. And I just really love this graphic. And that End Violence Against Women International is a great reference. They have a library on their website. If you go to it, it's free. You can access all kind of information there. I'm just going to see, Melissa, we have a chat. Yeah, from somebody saying, I've had victims say they didn't know it was rape because they didn't get hit. Absolutely. Sometimes I had a client one time who was not from the US and originally was not her home country. And she didn't realize until 10 years later where she came, she was here and she saw in a movie that she saw somebody getting raped, and she realized that her husband had been raping her for like 15 years. So she didn't realize that was wrong, that she didn't deserve that.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
There are lots of myths about rape and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And I mean, working on a college campus, you would, I think, hope that a lot of the students that are 18 and older would understand what consent is and how to make sure that you have consent. But when I was at FSU, I taught a first-year experience class, and it was all freshmen to help them get acclimated to the campus life and the university and learn about services and resources. And we had a required component in every FYE class that was around sexual assault. And what I ended up talking about to them for like 90 minutes, every class, and we ended up redoing the entire presentation, was consent. Was focusing on knowingly, willingly, without coerced submission, and not being under the influence of any intoxicants, and that is informed consent. So that's real. It's people don't know that it's rape. People don't know that they're committing rape. We had a couple of survivors come into our office on FSU's campus, and the survivors were reporting the same perpetrator. Well, the perpetrator comes in, and of course I couldn't meet with them because I'd already met with the survivors. So he met with a colleague, and he was saying, you know, I'm being victimized because these women are going around saying that I raped them, and I didn't rape them. So my colleague literally sat this student down, who was probably 20 years old, and showed him the Florida statute of what sexual battery said. And she said he turned white as a ghost and said, according to this, I'm raping these women. So it's both sides don't understand what it looks like. They have this misconception of what rape looks like. So yes, that's a very common point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we're going to talk about victim blaming because, you know, as lawyers, we are, you know, part of the potential response if we're working with victims or survivors. And you'll notice Melissa and I kind of use it interchangeably. You know, it's up to our clients to self-identify. Some might identify as thrivers or something else, but we kind of go back and forth. With the language, there's not really a right or wrong term. It's up to the individual. So we'll talk about victim blaming because this very public response, especially when we're going to talk about some terrible court responses and how that can really feed into the trauma. And as responders, even if we're trying to be helpful, maybe we don't know, you know, we can incidentally or unintentionally contribute to the trauma. As part of the response. I know Melissa and I have both worked with survivors or victims, and I know, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, where they have reported that the actual response was worse than the rape. The response that they got either from law enforcement, from civil legal aid attorneys, from prosecutors, from family or friends was worse, and they wish they'd never come forward. So Melissa, do you want to take this? Because I think these are your slides. Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of a soapbox for me. So, you know, I could go on and on about this. So victim blaming, it's real. It happens. We see it particularly in social media now. And I know that you're lawyers, so you know the importance of language. And when you go into court, you know, you have your list of questions. And I know that you're very precise in the way that you ask your questions so that it can be admitted versus, you know, it being thrown out and you having to reword the question again. So I know that language, you all understand language and you understand its importance, but that needs to be at the forefront when you're interviewing the survivor in front of you in your office as well. You need to have the same care with your questions that you're asking to ensure that you aren't unintentionally causing them to blame themselves. So, you know, it goes without saying that it's not your intent that's behind the words, it's how it's perceived to the other person. So keeping that in mind when you're meeting with those clients can help them understand that you're a safe person to come to, that you're safe, that you're not going to cause more harm by them disclosing things to you that they may have not disclosed to anyone else. So just keep that in mind when you're meeting with survivors. And then questioning a victim in a way that accuses them of contributing to their the crime against them. The why questions. I think we mentioned it a few times in the slides, avoiding those why questions, because as soon as that word why comes out of your mouth, that survivor is going to be on the defensive. It automatically lends itself to the victim blaming. And by blaming victims, the perpetrator escapes accountability for their actions, which is where the blame needs to lie, is with that perpetrator, not with the victim. And the impacts of victim blaming are so often understated. And in the next few slides, we'll give examples of how detrimental victim blaming can be.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. And I don't think we have this information here as well. We had a cut. We could talk about this for days, so we did have to cut some information. But when we talk about victims, when you're working with a survivor, it's, you know, oftentimes you might find that they've suffered other abuse or other victimization in their lifetime. So when we talk about that, there are also statistics out there, and I probably won't be able to get it to Alexis today with these slides, but if you reach out to me or Melissa, The stats show, there's a very good study that shows that perpetrators often don't just perpetrate once, that they are repeat offenders. So like, just like Melissa's example with the student who didn't even realize that he was committing a crime, per se. I don't know. I have some thoughts about that we won't have to get into. I get the sense that he probably knew he was taking something that maybe he felt he was entitled to, even if he didn't think it was a crime. But it shows they perpetrate multiple times. So when we, when they escape a conviction, or law enforcement doesn't pursue a case, or a prosecutor can't pursue a case, or we don't seek an injunction on behalf of a client, or we don't other remedies for accountability, it allows that it's my opinion that it kind of emboldens them to continue perpetrating, and it contributes to the society, that entitlement. So let me move to, okay. So victim blaming, we're looking at, we see harassment just from, and this is from the public. A lot of times, I think Alexis mentioned in my bio, one of my passions is privacy for survivors, because when a lot of times when the case goes public, even if it doesn't go public and the client is anonymous, just some of the public comments, we tell clients don't read the comments, try to stay away from it, because they're awful. And like we mentioned, we've heard from clients who said, I wish I'd never reported. They might experience harassment, vilification. So I've worked with young women who were young teens who were, and often women who are raped by an older person, typically in a lot of cases has been a man, and they're blamed for enticing. Oh, she enticed him, he's a good married man, he's a man of the church, she's a slut, she was dressing inappropriately, or whatever, these comments. It's amazing, and to see what vilification even children victims experience. So death threat, and those are actual things that some of my clients have experienced. Death threats, friends choosing sides, and often it's not the victims. And these are some comments, and I think Melissa and I both kind of contributed to this slide. These are some comments that were either in the pulled from the media. This one down here, the young man comes from a good family who put him into an excellent school where he was doing extremely well. He's clearly a candidate for not just college, but probably for a good college. His scores for college entry were very high. And then also, however, beyond losing her virginity, the state did not claim that the victim suffered any further injuries, either physical, mental, or emotional. Those actually came from judges. So we know what you guys are representing clients. These are victims of sexual violence. These are not easy cases. Because you're not even, I'm sorry, oftentimes you might not even find a sympathetic judge who can even provide a semi-compassionate response. And a lot of times things that judges say in court can also have that detrimental impact on the clients. So we know you guys are, if you're taking these cases, you are fighting often an uphill battle. But there are a lot of judges who do get it. And even if they can't find in favor of a victim, they're very careful with their language, like Melissa mentioned. Melissa, do you want to talk about this James is Dead video? Because you were just telling me about that before we started.
Yeah. So I wanted to just share this link. I know we don't have time to watch it today, but it kind of interjects some humor into our work, which is, we all need some humor when we're doing this type of work. But if you saw the consent tea video, which was really popular a few years ago, comparing, drinking tea to consent, I believe it's the same people. It has the same little stick figures, and it compares, talking about a murder that happened as you would a rape. And it just shows how, and it goes into victim blaming language, and it just shows how ridiculous it sounds when put in that kind of framework. So if you have time, I encourage you, to go back and take a look at that video.
Thanks, Melissa. And I have a comment from Nicole, who says that they've heard immigration judges claim that one rape isn't persecution. So pretty disgusting things that we see from from folks who are responsible for making decisions and potentially protecting these people. Thank you for sharing your experiences, by the way, you guys. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this up. Melissa, hopefully get all these. Okay. So victim blaming, going back again, victim blaming in response, it can be re-victimizing and re-traumatizing. Peer victimizations, and a lot of this, excuse me, if you see the study referenced on the bottom, this is specifically looking at adolescents who, as we've already stated, experience high rates of victimization, and the folks are often experiencing it at a young age. Can be re-victimizing and re-traumatizing. The peer victimization, so I'm not a social psychologist or a social worker. Melissa's a social worker, but I work with enough of them, and I've learned that, especially with the adolescents, they're developing their identity during this time. As we see in the bottom, they're forming their self-image, and with social media, especially they're utilizing, social media as a tool, or through social media, they're kind of forming a sense of self, and things that happen, or things that might be said can be deeply traumatizing and have severe impacts throughout their lives and at this developmental stage. And they can experience high rates of depression. Suicidal ideations and attempts are very high for victims at this age. And then Melissa, do you want to kind of expand on that as the actual social worker?
Sure. I mean, it really creates an additional level of trauma for survivors when they're having to not only cope with the act of the sexual assault, but also everything that happens afterward, the words of their friends and family, the systems, any system that they can touch, medical system. I had one survivor come in and tell me she was underage, she'd been drinking, and she was raped in a bathroom. And the medical provider who was supposed to do her exam said, well, did you learn your lesson? So victim blaming it's part of our society. It's part of how we respond to things. It's there. And I think the question on this slide, would you report if you were assaulted? I mean, I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and I had no idea what I would do if I were assaulted tomorrow. I have no idea that I would report, given what I've seen the system do to survivors of sexual assault. It's like this next slide here.
Oh, yeah, Melissa, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah. So this is Judge Robin Camp, and he was a judge in Alberta, Canada, and it was a pretty highly publicized case. And some of his words were, included in articles of what he said to the survivor. So he asked her why she couldn't just keep her legs closed. He went on to ask her why she couldn't tilt her pelvis to avoid penetration. And then he went on to give the suspect, you need to make sure that you're protecting yourself. You have to be careful, rather than saying, make sure that you have consent before you proceed with any sexual acts with a partner. And then he went on to share his knowledge of women, that young women want to have sex, particularly when they're drunk. Again, another consent issue. You can't give consent if you're intoxicated. And then at the end, he was, brought up before and had to sit before a panel of his peers and was removed from the bench. But that same year, he was reinstated as a lawyer. So I wanted to mention this because even though people may not be as open with their victim blaming as Mr. Camp here, there are still people that are thinking these things, even though they're not verbalizing them. And they can be law enforcement, they can be medical personnel, they can be judges that you're in front of, they can be attorneys that you're arguing with or against in the same courtroom. So I think it's important to just keep this in mind and hopefully use it to educate others when given the opportunity.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, and unfortunately, some of you might have experienced some level of this. This is kind of a fairly egregious. This is what he said, right? Like, so you can imagine what some judges are thinking and don't say, or if you're working with juries, these are things that people think. So, and these are things that that are realities in the work that we do. I'm going to quickly, so we have about, no, we have, I think we're about halfway through. So just to give another example, I don't, some of you might have heard about this documentary or even watched it. Audrey and Daisy, they were two teens who were raped. They didn't know each other. They were raped in different states in the same year, and kind of brought attention to, they were, after reporting, they were victims of community harassment and bullying. Law enforcement, they received very poor responses from law enforcement. They both ended up dying by suicide. So Audrey died within days of her assault, and Daisy ended up committing suicide just a couple of years ago. And Daisy's mother actually committed suicide a few months after her daughter. So we see the grave impacts that this crime has on communities and families. And also, I haven't seen it, but there's Unbelievable is another show, like mini special series or on Netflix. I haven't watched it just because, you know, when I go home at the end of the day, I try to focus on other things. But a lot of folks in our, Melissa, I don't know if you watched it, but a lot of folks who we work with said that it was pretty good. So if you wanted an idea about how the system can respond in a good or negative way to victims, that's a good example as well. So Melissa is going to get into neurobiology and trauma. I did see a question about what is one practical tip for attorneys, and I don't have just one. I couldn't synthesize this down into one tip, but to maybe educate yourself. I think we're going to jump into a little bit more meat about understanding neurobiology and trauma, and this information can help you when you're interviewing a client, which we'll talk about when you're interviewing a client or try to litigate on their behalf. This can help, this is good to create an understanding about why they might be answering the way that they are and why they might have acted a certain way for folks who aren't as familiar with victims of sexual violence. We don't get into actual different types of cases that can be litigated on behalf of clients. I think that would be a different training and multi-day or hour training. But this is more about understanding at the kind of at those beginning stages before moving ahead with representation. So Melissa, this is your slide, so I'll let you take it.
Yeah, and I think one of the tips is you're here right now. You're gaining this knowledge and this information. You're open and you're willing to receiving it, and I think that's the best thing you can do. And continue on your own to educate yourself and those around you about the impacts of trauma. So we're going to go into some neurobiology of trauma. I'm going to try to move through this so that we can get it all in. So the neurobiology of trauma is really the science behind victims' reactions, and it goes into how the body responds, both physically, mentally, to the trauma that's occurring to them. So it can help you understand why victims may not be responding in a way that you think that they should, given the circumstances that they're in. So we're going to take a look at how this all fits together, and then specifically look at two pieces. One of those is how it impacts their reaction, and how it also impacts the way their memory is laid down, and how they're able to recall what occurred during their victimization. You're in charge of slides. You can pull them up, Teresa. Thanks. So before we jump into this, I wanted you all to think about a time when you experienced a traumatic event. It could be a car accident. It could be maybe you were in college, you came home and your apartment had been robbed. Whatever that looks like, just think about the responses that you felt. Maybe, you felt like tingling, maybe your ears were ringing, just all of these responses in your body that you had no control of. Your body was just responding to an event. So keep kind of that in mind as we move through this. And then we're going to look at and hopefully help explain why victims' behaviors don't make sense. And then we're going to talk about traumatic memories, and you're going to be able to answer these questions hopefully by the end. Okay, so we'll start with the stress hormones and how those impact the body and the brain when a survivor is experiencing an assault. So the catecholamines are the natural adrenaline. They kind of pump the body up and get it ready for that fight, flight. And for some people that bottoms out and they freeze and they don't have that hormone to rely on to get them out of the situation. Opioids are also another hormone that are released during a trauma or a crisis when your body senses fear, and they're known as the natural morphine in the body. So they're in charge of kind of blocking the pain, and not only blocking the physical pain, but also that emotional pain that you're experiencing. So sometimes that's why survivors kind of have that flat affect and aren't, upset or crying or emotional or shaking. That those opioids are running through their body, so they're completely flat and they're not having the reaction that you might anticipate someone in that situation having. Cortisol is another hormone that is released, and it affects the body's energy level. Again, this is another hormone that can bottom out. So some people may have lots of energy and have the ability to flee the situation, and for other folks, it just kind of bottoms out for them, and they don't have a lot of energy, so they can't respond in the way that they may want to, or they may think they would if told they were in that situation. And then the last one here is oxytocin, which may kind of sound strange that a hormone that makes you feel good is released during, a traumatic event. But again, it's trying to just mitigate that pain that you're experiencing, physical pain, emotional pain, mental pain. So it promotes that well-being. And this hormone may be the reason that you see survivors smile or laugh in a situation that you may think, well, that's completely inappropriate for them to be laughing. There's nothing funny about this situation, but they don't have control over how many of these hormones release into their system, how much of those hormones they have, nor do they have control over the response, because those hormones are just circulating in their body and they're responding to those hormones that are active. So these stress hormones can be active in the body for up to 4 days after a traumatic event. And they can be re-released if a survivor is triggered. If they're triggered by something in their environment, those hormones can be released again and they can get really amped up again. So if they're in your office and they're having these conversations about the assault, you can start to maybe kind of see some of these behaviors coming through because those hormones are getting released again and they're starting to circulate. So don't be surprised if they're responding in a way that you think might be a little inappropriate given the circumstances. It's, every survivor has an individual response, and that's okay.
Thanks, Melissa. And from kind of a litigation standpoint as well, I know I said we weren't going to get into this, but if we understand this and just to be perfectly honest with you all here, I didn't, coming in as an attorney in 2008, I didn't understand this. I didn't know these things. It's working over time. I like to share this information because I responded poorly to some clients in the past who, and looking back, like, oh, that's why they were acting that way. They weren't lying to me. And it's just having worked with Melissa over time and learning these things, unfortunately, by trial and error, that we can share this with you. And also knowing this information can kind of help you or help us as lawyers explain this to a judge or prep case strategy, potentially like looking to onboard some experts into your case strategy, which I know, and I think a lot of us here are legal aid attorneys or nonprofit attorneys. So that's not right. Like, oh, expert witnesses mean money that typically we don't have, but there are, creative ways. And when we're happy to talk to you about that, there are, experts out there, folks like Melissa. There are folks at your local rape crisis centers and your shelters who you might be able to qualify as witnesses, because this is how we educate the judges. And even if you get a poor response from a judge, and start educating the court systems as well. If you get a deplorable response, he could, set you up for an appeal. So just from a litigation standpoint, hopefully this might give you guys a little bit of confidence or some ideas for moving ahead. and give you some options like, well, this is great, but how do I explain this to a judge? There are, experts out there who could help you with that, help you build your case and explain these things. Because you're going to have to, the judge is going to be, like Melissa said, don't ask why. The judge is going to be thinking in their head, well, why? Potentially thinking that, depending on your judge. So
Yeah, great point, Teresa.
there you go, Melissa.
Sexual assault programs are a great place to start for folks who have knowledge of the impacts of trauma. And if they don't have someone on staff, likely they know someone in the community who could speak to it. So the brain on trauma, this is what it looks like. Of course, we know there are left side and right sides of our brain. So the left side during this actually shuts down, and that's the side where where you can find the executive functioning, the analytical side of your brain, the thinking side of the brain, or your new side of our brains. So that side actually shuts down, and our primitive brain takes over, which is the right side. So on the right side of the brain, your senses are heightened. So a lot of those memories are being stored in your senses as you're experiencing this trauma. And the right side controls those senses, and as well as memories and intuition. So we may think we want to know how we'll respond in a situation, but chances are we will have no control over what our response is when we're experiencing a crisis or a trauma. So I want to touch a little bit more on memory. So normal memory is stored, in a logical kind of sequential order, like this neat little filing cabinet, and we can retrieve those memories anytime we call upon them. But traumatic memory is stored differently. And this next slide is very heavily relies on Rebecca Campbell's research. A lot of this relies on her research. She is a professor at Michigan State, and she's pretty much the guru of neurobiology of trauma. So she describes it as, memory, traumatic memory. Just picture the messiest desk you could possibly think of. It could be your desk, who knows? And then I want you to write down, all of these fragmented memories on Post-it notes. Then I want you to put those Post-it notes all around that desk. I want you to put them in drawers. I want you to put them in files. I want you to put them underneath the desk. And then I want you to leave. And then I want you to come back to it. And I want you to take all those Post-it notes and put them in order of occurrence. And that is a picture of what we're asking survivors to do with their memories, because they're stored in this fragmented way. They're not stored like normal memories in that, logical sequential order. They're not neatly stored or easily retrieved. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're talking to survivors. Because of that hormone release, they're there, but sometimes they're not at the surface, and they come out and are expressed at different times, and the survivor doesn't have control over when those memories are released. So we're gonna go ahead.
Do you want me to play? I think we have about 30 minutes. Do you want me to go ahead and play this?
Yeah, I think it's only about 2 minutes.
Okay, so guys, I have to do some.
Yeah, sorry, we couldn't get this video to embed, so Teresa's being kind enough to pull it up and play it from the spot. But I know a lot of you probably paid pretty close attention to the Ford Kavanaugh hearings. And so the video that we're going to show is some of her, Christine Blasey Ford's testimony during those hearings, where she describes the events. So just kind of key in on anything that stands out for you in this video, and then we'll kind of come back and talk about it a bit more.
Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Would expect that he would remember that this happened. Can you tell us what you don't forget about that night?
The stairwell, the living room, the bedroom, the bed on the right side of the room. As you walk into the room, there was a bed to the right, the bathroom in close proximity, the laughter, the uproarious laughter, and the multiple attempts to escape, and the final ability to do so.
Last night, the Republican staff of this committee released to the media a timeline that shows that they've interviewed.
Sorry, I'm trying to stop
who
it.
claim they were the one.
Okay,
You're good.
go back to the slides. I think that was the part, right, Melissa?
Yeah, that was the
Just
part.
Pulling.
That was good.
Okay.
So on this next slide that Teresa will pull up, it's what did she remember? And how do you think those were stored? How did she describe things? And what did she not remember? That wasn't mentioned on the video, but I'll talk some about that. So if you can just type in the chat what kind of stood out to you, what she remembered from that event, so that we can just chat about that for a minute.
Okay.
The bedroom, yeah. The bed on the right side. Yes. Objects in space, yes. So snippets and not complete thoughts, absolutely. So it's that fragmented memory. So she remembered where the bed was. So that's one of her senses. Yes, the sounds, the laughter. So that was also stored in her memory. And then the memory of trying to get away, that physical, tactile, trying to pull away. So a lot of her memories were fragmented, but they were there. Like they were very specific and they were very detailed, and they may seem like random details, but those are the things that her body and her mind told her were important at that time. So these memories, because of that hormone release, are actually engraved deeper in our memory than normal memories. We know some memories wear away over time, not these traumatic memories. They stay there and they're engraved in our memory. They may come out at different times, like I said, but they're there. It just takes time for them to kind of resurface. So what wasn't in the video is what did she not remember? But if you paid attention to this hearing, you'll remember that they made a really big deal about, she doesn't remember how she got home. She didn't remember how she got home. Isn't that an important detail? Wouldn't that be something that you would remember? Well, her brain deemed that not important, because those traumatic memories are stored to protect us in the future, to avoid another trauma, to avoid another injury. So the brain didn't store that information because it deemed it not important. What it deemed important was the room, what she was hearing, her heightened senses. Anything that was stored in her senses, she was able to talk about. So I think that video really helps kind of explain that. And then trauma displayed. These are things that survivors you may witness right in front of you in your office. And a lot of times this is misdirected. Again, they're talking about a traumatic event, those hormones are being released, and they're expressing whatever is the emotion that those hormones are triggering for them. So it's really common for them to appear agitated. They can laugh, they can smile. They can't concentrate or get you, the documents that you need. You have to keep reminding them because they're forgetting. They're having flashbacks and they're being triggered. So those hormones are being released again. And then that hypervigilance is extremely common. That inability to like relax and, sleep or just kind of let down their guard. They're constantly looking around them and making sure that they're safe. The disassociation is common as well. And then of course the fight, flight, or freeze, that they can be stuck kind of in that fight, flight, or freeze response for a period of time. And then when it doesn't make sense, I know all of you have experienced this at one time or another. The victim didn't fight back. I think that one's pretty easy to explain. They were trying to protect themselves. They ordered pizza before calling the police. Okay, they went inside to order a pizza. The perpetrator was inside. They were assaulted. Well, what did they come inside to do? Order a pizza. So they go back to what they were doing before the assault, which was order the pizza. Then they call the police. Walked right by an officer and didn't report. They wanted to get home because they wanted to be safe. They didn't feel safe on the street talking to an officer. They wanted to get home first and call someone. They went back to the party like nothing had happened. Well, their ride was there. They didn't have an option. They couldn't leave. Didn't report a second perpetrator till the third interview. Well, the second perpetrator was a lookout that, didn't touch them. They weren't involved in anything else. So the victim deemed that not important to share. So think about the things that what you have witnessed with some of your clients or heard about in the media. and think about how those things can be explained by what we've just discussed today.
And like some folks even mentioned, like they didn't know, like Melissa mentioned, they didn't know it was rape. They didn't know what happened was wrong. You know, maybe they felt like it wasn't okay, but they didn't, you know, there's the self-blame, there's the doubt in their minds. So that all contributes to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about interviewing clients, and like Melissa said before, and she has indicated down here, to avoid the why questions. And I know this can be frustrating for, you know, we saw Christine Blasey Ford, and right, as attorneys, a lot of us for the most part are type A. So when I, you know, start out like, well, what happened? When did this, what happened next? Then what happened? Wait, no, go back. Like, what happened after this? I've had to like break away from that. I really want things in sequential order, and that just doesn't, you know, you guys are probably smarter than me, and you know that's not realistic, or it took me time to learn that. So like somebody mentioned, is like she was just pulling like whatever she could remember. She was pulling it from her memories and reported it wasn't a sequential, this happened, this wasn't a linear recitation of what happened. And as we saw a little bit, you know, focus, and this can be important too for litigating and strategizing cases and trying to build that, I hate to use the word credibility, but I know that in court, right? Like we look for credibility of our experts, credibility of our witnesses. So I'm going to use that in this space. I hesitate to use it when talking about victims because so often their credibility is questioned outside the courtroom or within the courtroom. But these are, you know, as attorneys, we want to build that credibility. And these are things questions that you can use to gather evidence to build your case. And we do a law enforcement training at the council as well. And our law enforcement trainers are sex crimes detectives. They're really good at like, they use these questions to train the detectives. We'll ask for other things because that can lead to more information. So what did you, like Melissa says, avoid the why questions. So tell me more about what your thoughts were when this happened. What did you feel? What did you see? What did you smell? What did you taste? And there's little to no coding, encoding of peripheral or context details. To use an example from one of our detectives in his training, and the detectives will tell you the same thing, you know, they started out not necessarily believing, or this doesn't make sense, or this is crazy. And a lot of them, if you look them up, you know, as they're in their consultant pages, they'll talk about, you know, they had a transformation over time. And in starting to ask these questions, they led to some of them gathered evidence. One of them in asking, I think he asked, what do you remember seeing? And it was something really random that I think it was an adolescent victim remembered seeing, and something about, or no, I heard him flush the toilet. So the detective was like, okay, well, I don't know how I'm going to use that. And then over time it was a septic system. So they went to the septic tank and found used condoms that the perpetrator had used, and they were able to pull the DNA from them. So this can actually lead to evidence, you know, and other things that you can use to kind of build your case. Melissa, I don't know if you want to add to that, but asking the what instead of the why, because the why can feel very judgy and kind of disconnect us from the trust and the rapport we're trying to build with our clients.
You're good.
You're good? Okay. Yeah, trust and rapport is so crucial in the attorney-client relationship, right? We know we're going to have a better outcome in our case, and we're going to be able to build that case better if the client trusts us. And is more open with the information. And I feel like probably no matter what client you're working with, right? What do we always experience as attorneys? Is there some information that might be left out? There might be something that they're embarrassed to tell us, even if we're not talking about a victimization. You know, I think we've probably all been in court where something has come out and that could have been, you know, I could have been prepared for if I had that information ahead of time, could have prepared to mitigate it or be prepared to address it. That's especially true when you're working with victims of violence and sexual violence victims. They might forget something, but they might be embarrassed. More often times than not, they're embarrassed. They think we're going to judge them, so they leave it out. They need to know that we believe them. If you're working with a victim or survivor, something that I do urge you to do if you are sitting in an interview with a client, you're like, I don't know that I believe this. This just sounds so crazy. Try really hard to withhold that. Please call somebody, call an advocate, work with your local rape crisis center or shelter, call somebody who you trust and talk that out with them. It's important to have those relationships. As I mentioned, I learned a lot of this because I made mistakes in the past. But I have deep trust with Melissa, who I've worked with since I was in law school. And I'm able to talk these things out to her, and she can explain them to me and help me understand what's going on, or, refer them to an attorney who might have experience with that, but just try really hard not to put to judge them, or try to look like you're judging them. It's almost always going to require multiple meetings and interviews with a sexual violence victim, because you've got to build that trust with them. Like Melissa said, memories come out, information comes out over time. They're not always going to have that information right away. For those of you who are injunction attorneys, I know that's not always possible. When I was at legal services, sometimes I was meeting my client the first time 10 minutes before court. So I know that's not always possible. But if you do, just try to budget in those meetings you're going to need to have in that extra time. If you're working with advocates, the cases that we take at the Florida Council, and this is up to the client as well, because they have to trust their advocate, but we prefer to always be working alongside an advocate, because as attorneys, we're not the first person they've told their story to. I don't think I've ever been the first person who the client or the victim or survivor is telling what happened to them. They've usually gone through law enforcement or a prosecutor or an advocate or a friend or family member. So this is not the first time they're telling their story. They might have told it multiple times, and they might have had bad responses. They might have had a bad response from law enforcement. They might have had, something an advocate might have done unintentionally, might have felt judgmental to the client. So just remember, they might have gone through multiple rounds of, telling the story and getting kind of bad feedback, negative feedback, or feeling judged. So to just be very patient. And when you're working with those advocates, I have found that it's a little bit easier if they come in with the advocate and the advocate's like, I've worked with Teresa for years. There's just kind of a little bit more trust automatic there. If they have that trusting relationship with the advocate, they might be work with you a little bit more easily. Again, the information disclosure, you just have to build that trust to get those, quote unquote, bad facts out, or something that you might need to mitigate in court. But that, a lot of times they'll tell you right away. I've actually found that my teen clients are very open with what happened. There's some of my favorite clients that I feel like they're some of the easiest clients to work with. But just build that trust. Once they know they can trust you, and you're also working with them and explaining your case strategy to them, and they are part of that process where they are, strategizing and building the case alongside with you, and they understand why it might be important to have that information and how you're planning on addressing it. And again, it just takes multiple. Usually my first interview with a client, I tell them they don't have to tell me anything they don't want to tell me. They can tell me as much or as little as they want to. They're just me. I'm a stranger to them, and I'm asking for, potentially the information about potentially the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So just be very mindful of that. And also be mindful of your internal biases. I think there's like a Harvard test or online, something that you can take online that'll help you identify your own biases. And just be mindful of those. We all have them, whether we're conscious of them or not. Be really mindful of them. If you're not trusting what somebody is telling you, maybe try to cut the interview short, call the advocate and talk to them, or maybe know that you're not the attorney for this client, and try to find them somebody else to work with. So Melissa, I don't know if you want to add to that.
And you may become their person. I mean, that's entirely possible. They may, feel safe with you and feel supported by you, and they may start telling you things that they haven't told anyone else. And they may need to retell their story multiple times, and you may not have time for that, but that means that they trust you. And a lot of times retelling their story gives them some kind of sense of understanding of what happened, or sense of control over what happened. So I know you may not have time, but try to welcome that as much as you can.
Yeah, and the other great thing about working with an advocate is that they can handle a lot of that emotional load, and you can focus on that's really helpful to get that information that you need for the case, because we don't always need to know, like Melissa said, they might want to tell us more than, you're sitting there like, I don't need to know, all of this information. But it's helpful, you sit there and listen to them and build that trust with them. Also, if you are working alongside an advocate, they can handle that crisis. So when they are triggered, the advocates can help them with crisis intervention. If they're working with a therapist or a clinician with some therapeutic services. So services are really important, and they can help you to have a potentially more successful outcome in your case. Obviously, that's dependent on many factors, but I know we're not always touchy-feely as attorneys, but the advocates are, and the therapists are. So really building those relationships. If you're going to do this work, please build those relationships with your local advocates. Is there anything to add here, Melissa? Do you want to talk about when you can't help? I know this is important.
Yeah, this slide I think was originally taken from a training I did with prosecutors. And I worked in offices with prosecutors where they would send a letter saying that they weren't moving forward. And it was on, a child sex crimes case or something. And I know that letters likely go out from your office automatically, but if a survivor of sexual violence is getting notified that you're not able to assist them, simply just picking up the phone and calling them means the world, to say, look, I believe you, I want to support you, but I've reviewed your case and there's nothing here that I can help you with, and encourage them to seek support at their local rape crisis center. That's all I would add.
Yeah, and if you do have the time to sit down with them, obviously that's ideal. I had some cases in Tallahassee where the judges, occasionally would take time to explain why they couldn't issue an injunction, or they couldn't rule a certain way. That's not always the case, but I think that is really helpful as well. I've worked with clients who I had in 1 week, I had 2 calls from 2 different clients. I had a client who's so happy with the relationship she had with the prosecutor. And in that case, the alleged defendant, or the defendant, was acquitted of the crime, but she was happy with just that she'd had communication with the prosecutor. They had kept her informed. They had explained the process to her. And this sounds crazy, but even 2 days later, I had a call from another victim who was upset. And that perpetrator had actually been convicted and sent to prison, but the prosecutor never talked to her, and it kind of kept her. She had felt like she was kept out of the process. And she had a terrible experience. So it's not always the conviction or the acquittal, but it's the response that they get from those who are supposed to be helping them. And that includes us a lot of times. So trauma-informed representation, I feel like this is, at this point, we've talked about this, or it's kind of self-explanatory. Listen to them, meet them where they are. They might not be ready for that $10 million lawsuit, but explain to them their options, and just be compassionate, and let them have input and control into the process as much as possible. Believe them, just show that End Violence Against Women International, they have this saying, start by believing. So come into the meeting ready to believe them. Just be ready to believe, even if you can't at the end of the day pursue a case for them. Maybe statute of limitations has expired, maybe the evidence just isn't there to take it forward. I have a mentor, I'm still friends with her, but my mentor from my days at Legal Services had explained to a client one time that there is a gap between what is right and what the civil justice system or the criminal legal system will provide. And there's a lot in between there, and it's not always fair. But that doesn't mean that something didn't happen. And that doesn't mean that these folks don't deserve a compassionate and empathetic response. Encourage them to seek treatment for physical and emotional trauma. let them make decisions. We've talked about this. If you're going to use the title Mr., Dr., Judge, Miss, Mrs., to refer to the accused, also use that when referring to the victim as well. So treat them in kind. I actually had a judge scold me because I was referring to the respondent as the respondent in a case, and then I would refer to my client by her first name, and the judge did not like that. But that's an aside. She was on to me with that one. But if you are going to be respectful of the accused or the perpetrator, offer that as well with using a title to the victim. I'm going to let Melissa talk about safety planning, and as an attorney, this is really helpful as well. So it's not always just about litigation at the end of the day. What motion are we going to file? What petition are we going to file? When you're working with victims of trauma, there's a holistic response to it, and that includes safety planning, which is where the advocates can be really helpful. So Melissa, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so hopefully your client will be working with an advocate or a rape crisis center to help with the safety planning piece. This may be something that you go into with the client if they're looking to get an injunction, exploring places that they may need to develop safety plans. It may not just be at home. It could be at school, it could be at work. For instance, if it's, a college student, it could be, they attend the same class, and, in college, you need certain classes to fit into your schedule, and maybe they don't have another section available. It could be, okay, well, let's do some planning around this class. Okay, let's contact the university and let's put a new contact order in place, and let's talk about this specific class. There may be 2 doors that they can enter and exit. The perpetrator gets there 10 minutes before class, and stays 10 minutes after, and allows the victim to come and go. But just setting up some things around, everything that the survivor, every community that the survivor might be involved in is really critical. I think the starting question is the perpetrator known to the victim. Do they know the victim? Do they know where the victim frequents? Do they have their phone number? Do they know their name? Can they find them on social media? What are all the different ways that they may come into contact with that perpetrator? What's their support system like? So if they're not feeling safe, can they go to someone else's house? Can they, can they stay overnight? Can they leave important documents with someone? Or, are they comfortable with a neighbor that they can share a photograph of the perpetrator, maybe a description of their vehicle, so that there's an extra set of eyes kind of looking out for the survivor as they come and go. So all of those things are important to address. And we actually, I think Alexis is going to share a document from the Victim Rights Law Center. It was written specifically for the LGBTQ plus community and safety planning, but it's definitely transferable to other communities and other folks. And it has probably 2 or 3 pages of questions at the end of the document that I think are really helpful in guiding safety planning. And top tips I would say would be electronic copies of documents, because if a survivor isn't feeling safe, they're not going to go and collect their folder with all of their documentation in it. So making sure that they have electronic copies that they can get when they're out of a situation. Safe housing is always critical, making sure that a survivor has a safe place to go and that they feel safe in their home, and putting up safety planning around their housing. And then contacting the local sexual assault program, providing that information to survivors is also very important. They can get counseling, they can get advocacy, they can discuss their options. Sexual assault programs are also connected with, the examination part. If that's what a survivor decides to do, they often have connections with local law enforcement and and the detectives. They may know one that's more trauma informed than another that they can set the survivor up with if they do decide to report. So all of those things can be helpful to get through your sexual assault program. Okay. Do you want to go through this?
Yeah, so just to recap, and I think this might be our last slide, and maybe we have some time for questions. So just avoid the victim blaming language. Traumatic memories are they're still accurate. They're not less accurate because they're not relayed in sequential order. And it may take time to pull those together. Leaving out details doesn't mean they're necessary, that they're lying. It's the impact of trauma impairing their ability to recall the events. And very few, there's a lot of, it's very easy to say it's a false report, it's a false report, it's a false report. Studies have shown that less than, I think, 5% of sexual assault reports are false, and I don't know how that's really determined, even if those are false. And it's on par with other reports of crimes. So that tracks with, you know, other reports of folks who are coming forward to report being victimized for property crimes or other types of crimes. It's the same, but it definitely gets blown up, I think, in the sexual assault context. And there's no right or wrong way to respond to a trauma. Every survivor's response is an individual response. So treat them like an individual, let them have that control and access into their case strategy, explain things to them. If you can't take a case, I sit down and I explain to them why, you know, maybe I'm not the lawyer for them, you know, so we try to find, you know, somebody else to work with them. So that's important as well, just to take that time, try to budget that time in, and I know y'all are very busy. Melissa, did you want to add to that?
No, I think you hit it.
Okay, so we have some references here, and we have many more. We actually have an article that Melissa and I have been trying to find. I think it's sitting on one of our, like a hard copy sitting on one of our desks, about the importance of incorporating advocates into the process. So as a lawyer, how you can improve your outcomes by working alongside an advocate. And we're desperately looking for that, so we can get it to Alexis and she can get it to you guys. And then you have our contact information. So if you have any questions about any statistics that we threw out here, if you want more information about something, you can reach out to us and we can get you that information. But for now, I will stop talking to see if there are any questions.
All right, and I'm on mute. Thank you so much, Teresa and Melissa, for this important and informative training. It was absolutely wonderful. And I know on behalf of the legal aid community, thank you, much thank you to everything you do and for taking the time to really give us all of these resources. I think you hit most of the questions as you went, which always impressed when my speakers can do that. It's not that easy. So, you know, while I give some closing announcements, if anybody wants to put any other questions in the Q&A or the chat, please feel free in this time, and we'll try to get to them. But I did drop the CLE number into the chat. To read that out loud, it is 6291, and it is approved for 1 general and 1 mental illness credit. Tomorrow, within 24 hours, you all will receive an email from Zoom. That email will have this recording, the CLE number again, so don't worry if you miss it now. I took a screenshot of that resource page that you all put up, so I'll throw that in there as well. And I believe that Teresa and Melissa are going to follow up with a couple of more resources. Those will all be embedded in that email from Zoom in various links. As always, if you don't get that email, I think I already put this message in the chat, but let me just recopy it. You can always reach out to me directly if you don't get it. Sometimes things go to spam, you know, it happens. So just feel free to reach out to me directly. So I know you all are receiving lots of thank yous in the chat. I think that I'll read this one out loud. Amazing presentation, conveniently right before I have an appointment with a DV survivor. Well, that's what this is for, right? All those tools so you can get to that interview and do it with trauma-informed feet forward. And thank yous coming through. And with that, I think that we'll let you go, Teresa and Melissa. I'm sure you have plenty to do on the rest of your day. So thank you for participating in the statewide training initiative. Especially thank you for talking about this important topic. We received a lot of requests for training on this. And so I think that it's an understatement to say that you really help supply a really big need in our legal aid training community.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for the work that you do. You know, legal services work is not easy, but it's so important. Thank you.
All right. And as someone reached out about proof of attendance, please email me separately for all that stuff. It's not something I'm able to answer right here, right now. But again, I'll put my email in the chat. alexsalvarez@floridalegal.org. That will also be in that email from Zoom that you get. So yes, it's being recorded. Will we get the PowerPoint? I think no, right? The PowerPoint is, are you sharing the PowerPoint? No pressure. You don't have to.
Yeah, no, we're happy to do that.
Yes, to answer the question. So, all right, we're gonna let you go. Please feel free to email me that stuff. I'll follow up with all of you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for presenting, and have a wonderful rest of your, what is today, Wednesday? Wednesday.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.